All right, we've got a power panel here. First of all, Wendy Whitmore, an old friend, an old colleague, one of our first colleagues at CrowdStrike back in the early days, now runs as Senior VP of Union 42. She does consulting, managed services, and threat intelligence at Palo Alto Networks. Actually, right now, I think the largest company in the world, cyber company in the world by market cap. Yeah, cybersecurity. Heather Atkins, an old friend, a young friend, but known each other for a very long time. I just realized that was a really bad way to say it. We go back to 2010 in Operation Aurora, fighting the Chinese together all the way back then, and have done a lot of work together since then. Of course, from Google, was actually the first security employee of Google 22 years ago. Is that right? 22 years ago, and runs security at Google. Both Wendy and Heather are my colleagues on the Cyber Safety Review Board, and Heather is Deputy Chair of the Cyber Safety Review Board of CISOs. And Paul Vixie, who we've also known each other a long time, Deputy CISO at AWS, but also a legend in the field, DNS, and lots of other things that you've been involved in over the years. So I think combined, even though we're all very, very young, there's a lot of experience here and a lot of battle scars over the years. But of course, the title of the panel is How Will AI Transform Cybersecurity? I'll ignore the cheesy CyAIber. That's part of the title. But the security industry is clearly changing, both from an offensive perspective and a defensive perspective. And we started some of this conversation yesterday in one of the breakouts. But maybe we can start with the impact of generative AI. And let's focus on the new. Of course, AI has been around for decades. It used to be called machine learning. That's not new at all, but the rise of foundation models, LLMs, is really what we're talking about here. So let's kind of constrain our conversation to that. So first of all, from a threat perspective, Wendy, what are you seeing and where do you see this going in terms of adversarial use of generative AI?
Yeah, so I know Dimitri mentioned a little bit about my role, but just to give a little more insight, the work that we do at Unit 42, our teams are responding to breaches on a daily basis throughout the globe. So that's everything from nation state actors to cyber criminal actors. And the two areas that I would focus on related to Gen AI as part of those breaches has to do with the speed and the scale of the attacks. And those in particular, I think right now are the areas that we see the most impact, right? So speed, that's everything from the identification of new vulnerabilities and the ability to then leverage and build potential exploits in more of an automated capacity to reach that larger scale. And we've obviously seen it's, I think, been fantastic the last couple of days. So much focus on the supply chain. It not only impacts cyber, but attackers in particular are really leveraging the supply chain on the software side, as well as to hardware vendors to a degree, to be able to reach much larger scale. And so in those two areas, as well as in the human component. So what we've seen related to social engineering, we've talked about reducing the threshold and the cost, quite frankly, needed for written communications and verbal communications to be much more effective. We're absolutely seeing those today, especially when it relates to attacks from cyber criminals and being able to circumvent some of the internal processes of businesses combined with the technology components of it.
So basically, much better enhanced spear phishing and social engineering, where you could use both native language that's really well done, but also potentially other modes, audio, video, right, to try to get yourself inside of those target companies.
Absolutely, you got it. I would say on the verbal side, in particular, a lot of exploitation of help desks. So actual, the human side of an attack, right, to be able to continue to get more credentials. And there's another, on the cyber criminal side, you I think mentioned this yesterday on stage at one point. When we talk about Lapsus, which was the second investigation that we all did as part of the Cyber Safety Review Board, one of the areas that's made them to enable them to be so effective is what we think are native human language skills. the reality is now that is so much more pervasive for cyber criminals across the board, whether they actually have native English language skills or not, because of generative AI. So from the voice recognition software and personification, impersonating that can be done, as well as the actual written communications via email, via text, via Slack, any kind of written communication.
Heather, we've had this debate a long time, and I want to tell a quick story. Google was an investor, one of the early investors in CrowdStrike, and I had the pleasure of attending a dinner in San Francisco with Larry Page, and we got into a very heated discussion where he basically said, this was, I think, 2017. He said, in a few years, cybersecurity will be solved because of AI. I disagree with that strongly, but you've been trying to convince me for years that on the defensive side, everything is going to change because of AI. How so?
Well, let me actually start with the threat actors. I mean, I think that anything our red teams are currently dreaming up, or anything that you can think of in an obvious vein, we should assume that the threat actors are doing. And then there's a whole range of things that we will never see. If they're using large language models to do vulnerability discovery, they're not going to publish a blog post and say, here's how we did it. So you should assume that there's a set of things we can see and a set of things we can't. And we should assume that they're going to adopt those things very quickly, especially as it becomes cheaper to do so. But I do think, and I am an optimist in this sense, as I always have been, that security is roughly a data problem. If we can get enough data and telemetry about what's going on, either in the larger ecosystem or in our own networks, crunch that data quickly in innovative and interesting ways, like we actually have a chance probably to, if not prevent, at least disrupt quickly and evict threat actors. And LLMs are going to be an enabler to that in a way that we've never had before. And for that reason, I think despite all of the variety of things they're going to do, we will be able to do it better and faster. Think of it this way. If they are doing fuzzing on our code, we can actually fuzz that code before we release it, right? And we have the ability to do that. We do it in real time, do it at scale. And so
let me just ask a follow-up to that specific issue, because we are seeing some really incredible research coming out for discovering vulnerabilities in code, right? Not even fuzzing them, but actually just running the code through the LLMs and discovering a lot of the common vulnerabilities that take place. And you're absolutely right that if you're integrated, let's say in a compiler or interpreter, you can do all that before you even release the software package to the wild, right? Do you think that that will fundamentally, dramatically reduce the number of vulnerabilities we'll encounter in the wild?
I think large language models are going to completely change the whole development lifecycle, not just the compilation or interpretation of code, but as the developer is designing, as the developer is implementing, testing, etc. They're going to work in, I started writing C in VI, right? The developers today are writing, like their environment is a web page, and that web page is going to have, insights and highlights and, text box. The whole development lifecycle is going to be guided, right? In a way that it wasn't when we, made all of our vulnerabilities 20 years ago. And for that reason, the code that comes out the other side is going to have a very different quality to it. Hopefully for the best. That's what we want. And I think that'll make that and memory-safe languages are going to have a material impact on the applications we run every day. And that'll just raise the bar very, very quickly. The stuff at the top will be really novel and really unique. Now, this is a utopia, and I think Paul will probably tell me.
Well, let me just, we'll get to Paul in a second.
But I think it's important for us to think about just how different the whole world is going to be. It's not just for cyber, but for everything.
You say utopia, and let me agree with you, because we have an example of this in the mobile ecosystem, right? Where both Android and iOS platforms are way more secure than any computer we've ever had, computing device. And it's not that there are no attacks there, but there are so few that an average person never even thinks about it, right? If you are head of state or someone else under significant nation-state threat, your situation may be different, but virtually no cybercrime, right, that occurs from a malware perspective on those devices. It's not because it's impossible to exploit them, but the bar is so high that the cost is tremendous, and even nation states have to be very thoughtful about the targets they pick, right? Do you see that model expanding to our laptops, servers, and the whole?
It already has. I mean, if you look at modern operating systems, and by that I mean modern operating systems who've been rewritten from scratch. You have iOS, you have Android, Mac OS X, although we were talking earlier about it, Chrome OS, etc. There is a whole flavor of things that just don't exist there because the operating systems were designed with these things in mind. Right, and I think that that's how we solve these classes of problems. We go back, we rewrite, we do things differently. And I think, LLMs are going to give us the opportunity to do that for increasing amounts of developers. And the legacy operating systems, just by nature of the fact that they won't work as well, are going to, probably be considered a bit behind.
So Paul, I probably don't have to convince you in the power of data. You started this company called Farsight that collected passive DNS data across the world that was used for security purposes. How do you see, in your role now at AWS, but as a thought leader in the space for so long, the leveraging of these new technologies, not just machine learning, but generative AI technologies for defensive purposes?
Well, first, since Heather has reminded us that she has always been an optimist, I will remind you that I have always been a pessimist and rarely wrong. And so, as a thing, weird things my dad says, as my kids would describe it, nothing which can be abused won't be. Every vulnerability will be found. If it can be used to do harm to the owner, it will. If it's usable to amplify or replay or reflect, it will. What we have seen so far with LLMs and the new generative transformer-based AI is a democratization of the discovery of new ways to abuse things. It used to be that there was a minority of really technically astute people working in the attacker side, and then a whole bunch of copycats and script kiddies and so forth. And it turns out that if you don't really know how anything works, you now have an alternative to waiting for somebody else to discover something. You can now use this great new tool. There is, it's been a bit of a distraction to see the chatbots. I mean, that's what causes AI in this generation to be worthy of public attention, right? There's always been AI, but in 1957 it meant something very different. What it means right now is something that people on the street kind of understand because they can interact with a chatbot. But it isn't just text. As you mentioned, the graphical mode and the audio mode has made deepfakes much more possible, which sometimes will be used to attack the, Hollywood star whose face is being, used, or it could be used to fool somebody into doing something they wouldn't normally do. We have a whole human culture based on what we can trust. And so fairly often you'll be told, I'm sorry, I won't trust that, the transaction you're trying to start. Please call the following number. We're going to ask you for things. None of that is going to work, but we have not even started, not we at Amazon, but we as a world have not yet started on figuring out what we're going to do instead of figuring out if you can trust a talking head on your screen who has the right voice print or not. That technology is going to get a lot better before we start even figuring out, where we should be already. So we're late.
Can I challenge you on that, Paul, for a second? Because it can work both ways, because you could use LLMs to try to identify the deep fakes, right? And you also have efforts by the White House. We had Ben Buchanan talking to us yesterday in the executive order that pushing vendors like you, and Mark Warner just talked about it as well, to do watermarking so you can try to identify some of these fake stuff.
Peace, brother. I understand, we are going to have to use this technology in order to build the next generation of defense. But we're going to be late forever. And that comes down to the fundamental asymmetry. An attacker can only make money if they succeed. They don't get a paycheck otherwise. And when they make money from an attack, they know how much they made. So they have the whole cost-benefit history. We don't have any of that. We are really trying to be in some other business, and then defense is something we have to do to succeed there, which means it's a cost center, not a profit center. We hardly ever know what we would have lost if we had not won an engagement. So everything about our incentives is inverted from the attackers. And so we will necessarily be playing catch up. I'm not saying that we're, the gloom and doom, let's all turn off the power and go live in a tent. I'm saying that the advantage of these new technologies has always been with the attackers and will be in this case also. Now, finally, to answer your question, we are finding that there's a lot you can do with generative AI that doesn't look like a chatbot. And that doesn't mean that we don't have them and use them and so forth, but if you take a look at GitHub Copilot or Amazon Code Whisperer, it turns out that there are patterns in software source code that can be auto-completed, can be determined as anomalous, and you can even do consistency checking that isn't just point in time, gee, there's a line of code, it looks like that may be, I don't know, a key that could be used for cryptography. It's hard-coded, that's against policy. Well, it's never been possible to detect that if the key is in one place and it's passed around for a long time and constructed and deconstructed before it's finally used. But that type of flow analysis is now possible. And that's, I think, one of Heather's points just now is Emacs, by the way, would have been better for you than VI.
VI all the way.
Yeah.
We're going to have this debate now.
But the old way of doing this relied on hugely skilled people to drink a great deal of coffee. And we're going to be in a better situation in that sense. But we need the memory-safe programming language revolution to play itself out. There are, in other words, things that you can do in C or C++ that you just can't mitigate. What you have to do is stop using those things except in the tiny sliver of software that needs capabilities that you can only have from that. And everything else should be in a more modern language that doesn't, require you to juggle flaming chainsaws in order to succeed. And we're seeing all of that play out. But to your specific question, in security, when you're, let's say, processing a telemetry stream and you have access to data at rest, you're seeing data in motion from a lot of sources, and you're wondering what would something bad or potentially bad or probabilistically bad look like? Maybe what you'd really like to do is to characterize the norm and then wait for something to be outside of the norm so you can say, I think a human should look at this. That has always required a lot of hunt and peck, right? We try everything we can think of. And it turns out that now trying everything that we could think of has been democratized. So that's where I think we're going to raise the floor.
By the way, you have just witnessed, for those of you who are not hardcore nerds, one of the key religion battles in the tech community, the Emacs versus VI code editors. I'm squarely on the VI side, I have to admit. But so all three of you are part of companies that have huge teams working on security. And maybe we'll start with you, Wendy, but we talked about how generative AI, LLMs can help identifying code vulnerabilities, and certainly very exciting, but what about increasing the power of the people we've got, right? And helping us to automate so many of the tasks of looking for the signal and the noise, as Paul said, trying out a lot of possibilities. You run teams that stretch the gamut from services and MDR type of managed detection and response solutions at threat intel. How do you see generative AI either today or in the near future helping you to scale up without going to Nikesh and asking for 1,000 more people?
Yeah, that's a critical part of it. So the other side debate going on about optimism versus pessimism, I'll just throw my vote squarely in the camp of optimism as a general rule. That said, as an investigator, though, I also don't trust anyone. So it's this constant ongoing battle that I'm waging. But what you're talking about, Dimitri, and I think what Paul and Heather both mentioned as well, is like our ability to detect patterns at scale, right? When we're identifying and discerning whether it's malicious behavior or positive and allowable behavior. And that's an area where I think we are really benefiting from relative to generative AI, the use of LLMs, the ability of co-pilots to accelerate and automate so much of the workflow processes that on an investigative side, we have, and in a SOC and in so many other locations, right, that you've generally that repetitive behavior that oftentimes previously has been a lot more manual. So our ability to do that at scale, let's apply it to one specific use case, right? A nation state actor identifying a 0-day or spending potentially months, years to develop one. They then have to make a calculated decision as to which organizations they're going to target with that, because they do it to too many. There's obviously a larger likelihood that it gets detected. And we've seen that in so many recent cases. And the reality is that I think from a generative AI perspective, that will give us a distinct advantage to be able to detect those outliers, those patterns where something seems a little off, and that can be identified much more quickly. And we've seen that in practice in many recent cases. So that part of the equation really gives me a lot of cause for optimism, I think.
And you guys at Palo Alto obviously collect a lot of data from all the different security solutions that you sell. I'm sure you've been using machine learning for decades in trying to process that. Do you see interesting applications of LLMs in trying to analyze that data and get to the outcome quicker?
No doubt about it. So both at CrowdStrike, where Dimitri and I worked together many years ago, Palo Alto Networks, we are doing a tremendous amount. We not only call machine learning, but precision AI, right? So the ability to generate and insert automation and AI levels of code within our devices and our products to really be able to get those answers faster. So we're doing that in everything from pattern recognition to automation across. So XIM is a significant product of ours where we're moving into the space of being able to aggregate across the network, across the cloud, across endpoints. And we test most specifically in our own internal SOC. And in particular, the ability to accelerate the patterns across each of those unique data sources in a way that's to a single screen that leaves a very minimal amount of the most difficult problems for our SOC analysts and smartest humans to be able to respond to.
Heather, so Wendy brought up early in the panel the use of LLMs by threat actors. I'm wondering if we're perhaps overly concerned about that because you have, 7 companies, including yours, that is producing these highly capable foundation models. And, yes, there are some open source models that you can use, but they're generally considerably less effective. So if the threat actor is going to use Gemini or other platforms out there to craft spear phishing emails or fake video, etc., presumably you guys can catch that, hopefully prevent it, but get intelligence on what they're trying to do. So do we actually have a leg up in this technology on the adversaries in the way that we don't in other fields, because it's all, not all, but almost all cloud-based, where you have just a few companies that are controlling it, that are generating these most capable models that presumably can do a lot to thwart this malicious activity? Or are we too hopeful on that front?
I think that's too hopeful. I mean, I think if you are, working for the PLA, you're probably not using one of the big 7. You probably have your own.
But in terms of like regular criminals, right? They may not be.
Sure, yeah, they might be. But I have news for you. They've been searching on Google for a long time too, right? So it's not like they suddenly have this new information gathering resource. They've been looking up victims doing targeting on LinkedIn, et cetera, for a long time. So these tools have been available to them. Is it going to be easier because we've had Google Translate for a really long time, and by the way, it's been really good for a long time. And so I'm a little skeptical of like how much better it's gotten. Yeah.
But just let me ask this.
Yeah.
Because when you do Google search, sometimes you may just put one or two words in there, right? With these chatbots, you're interacting in a much deeper way. You're providing more context typically. It's not just one request, it's multiple requests. So presumably you guys have a lot greater insight into what a potentially malicious actor is doing than you would from someone putting a few words into Google Translate and trying to translate it into language, right?
Yeah, I mean, in theory. I mean, as much as anybody that, somebody searching for Dmitry Alperovich, the search itself doesn't tell us the intent, right? So are we looking at a red teamer, a vulnerability researcher, an intern,
Chinese embassy official,
or are you just Googling yourself? And so, I think the idea that somehow we've got magical intelligence on things is also just, a little bit, I'm a little skeptical of that. And also, we have privacy policies and things, and we want to be respectful. So, but I think the spirit of your question is that this is not like some new magical thing, right? They've had incredible intelligence gathering capability for a really, really long time. I don't think it'll just be the big seven. I think the big intelligence agencies will have their own. They'll have their own data training sets. And they will still go to, ChatGPT, Gemini, et cetera. These are text predictors. They are really creative, and they're great at creative tasks, but they are not knowledge oracles. And I think you're still going to continue to see knowledge oracles, Google search, for example, being a place where they go to fact check and kind of do intelligence on what you've posted about yourself, right? So, yes, it's a great tool. There are many great tools. We've had these tools for a long time.
Let me continue that thread with you, Paul, because stepping away from just the AI piece, you do have this move that we've seen that AWS pioneered with development of cloud systems that are used by the broader public to develop code, to host code, et cetera. And it is often said, and I agree with that a cloud is almost always going to be more secure than on-prem systems because you guys have, both of you, enormous teams that are working on this, and as the CyAIber report showed, have security solutions that are maybe better than one of your competitors. But you're also a target because you have so many customers. But do you think you have an inherent advantage because you can see very early on from the telemetry what is happening against one particular customer that may be sort of a high value target for someone and use that learnings very quickly to inoculate everyone else? Do you believe that the cloud is trying to change that asymmetry fundamentally between offense and defense, and then when you apply either machine learning or these new AI technologies to all that data you're collecting, that gives you an even more incremental advantage?
So yes, what I know about the CSPs, cloud service providers, is we are trying to, all of us, each of us are trying to use some of the native advantage that you get from being a concentration point. Cross-correlation has always been the most powerful tool in data science. And if you want to cross-correlate across a very large mesh of telemetry sources, then you would first have to figure out who can I share with, who's going to share with me, why should we trust each other, and so on. Whereas if you have a big cloud that is round in shape, like the object we all live on, you're getting that natively. And if you think about the history of other cybercrime in the what I'm now going to call the pre-generative AI era, three big examples should come to mind, which would be spam, distributed denial of service, or DDoS, and coin mining. And in that era, it was always beneficial to an attacker to first go look for a whole lot of unprotected computers all over the place so that they wouldn't appear to be coming from where they were really coming from, so that they could essentially steal the capacity represented by all those different nodes. In today's modern cloud era, that won't get you far enough. And so what you really look for now, if you want to perform that type of attack, is unprotected cloud systems. Customers of one of the big cloud providers who are using guessable passwords or other things like that.
But even there, you could do a lot to identify it proactively if it's on your cloud, right?
Well, I was about to say, coin mining is something that bad people want to do because those bitcoins or whatever they are, Dogecoins, are valuable. They can be traded for gold or cash or what have you. And so we see a constant barrage of people looking for ways to get into something where they can put some coin mining software. And that shows up if you just have net flow across a large enough set. That's like a network telemetry gathering system. But it also turns out if they succeed, if somebody gets into a cloud system, you can tell by the power utilization of the computer that it's on, because nothing looks like coin mining except coin mining. And so that becomes an additional thing that we can see, that if it was just a normal enterprise data center somewhere or just a gaming PC in somebody's house, nobody's watching that. And so the ability to see it and understand it and cross-correlate it really has given an advantage to detecting and alerting on both the attacks themselves and success in those attacks. So right now, we're ahead of the game. But I do want to go back to what you were saying a moment ago. We will, okay, so somebody told me at lunch yesterday that they had used ChatGPT to create a letter that was a low-value outcome. They had to produce it, and they didn't want to spend 30 or 40 minutes crafting it, and so they spent 3 or 4 minutes with prompt engineering, and they got the letter. I don't want to get that letter. I want to get the prompts. And if I start getting too many letters like that, I'm going to be employing my...
Well, you'll use ChatGPT or Gemini to summarize it, right?
Exactly. Just as it will have been used to create the fluffy thing, I will use it to defluffify it. And so what that tends to mean is that one of the biggest uses of this new technology will just be to cope with other people having used it also. And so, yes, we will get better at the type of cross-correlation I talked about. And then the bad guys will say, they're seeing what they did not used to be able to see. I must up my game to be harder to detect, and then we'll start losing, and then we'll say, we need to be better at seeing that. So there isn't an end game here.
Heather, I want to ask you this. This is not a cybersecurity question, but since you're one of the leaders, your company is one of the leaders in this generative AI space, the fluff, as Paul just called it, is increasingly starting to dominate the internet, right? So much of the content that is being produced now is coming out of these systems, and these systems are getting trained on this fluff. How much of that is a concern, and in terms of the training, that right now it's trained on the so-called wisdom, to the extent it's a wisdom of the internet, and that wisdom is becoming very circular and generated from these platforms. Is that potentially an enormous challenge for the future versions of these systems?
I think it's really interesting. The data scientists who work on search have had to deal with this for a long time, because they sort of have a love-hate relationship with the SEOs. It's a search engine optimizers, so people who will craft web pages on the internet, sometimes fake, sometimes they'll make millions of them, so that they can kind of sneak themselves up in the rankings if you were to search for something. And so we've been studying the fake content for a problem. Actually, Dr. Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, talked about this for a long time, that the kind of fake content and being able to see the difference has been a problem. Obviously, with LLMs, we've got automation that makes that bigger. But keep in mind, generative AI is not just about text. Generative AI is also about imagery, audio, etc. And you can already see this being built into some of the productivity products. Many of them. I'm most familiar with my employers, but the idea that a high school student doing a project with an idea, creative idea, maybe they're not very artistic, with a little bit of prompting can create a very high value, high engaging way to tell a story. Imagine what happens to us personally, individually, when we can tell our stories better, can actually help people connect human to human in ways that they didn't before. So I think you're gonna have the fluff. I think sometimes you're gonna have the fluff that's just lint, that maybe doesn't have any value, but maybe it's fluff, like marshmallow on a s'more, right? Which everyone will enjoy. So I think you're going to see a little bit of pro and con, and I think much like we've dealt with fake content in the SEO market, we will deal with the massive amounts of fluff. But believe it or not, I actually do see society already adjusting to this. I know universities who've gone back to in-person interviews instead of essays, who are doing oral exams instead of written exams, and trying to bring the human contact back together. This may force us actually as a society to lean into collaboration, to lean into the human to human. Just look at what happened with the Princess of Wales, when she took a very normal photo and, like anybody, popped it into Photoshop and tried to make it look nice, and how much scrutiny we put now on every little pixel out of place. That's changing our relationship with information already, and we will adjust to that.
Yeah, I remember it's also used in disinformation. In recent years, you had the Russians trying to discredit the claims about the atrocities in Bucha by claiming that the videos were faked because one of the bodies appeared to move a hand, even though that was an artifact just of the video capture, right? So some of that is going to be used for disinformation. Let me ask you all the same question, or variant of the same question. I'll start with Wendy, but it seems to me that one of the biggest changes that is underappreciated from a threat perspective in the last 10 years is the increasing move from a nation-state perspective towards the bridging of cyber and humans. And we've seen this, John Carlin prosecuted a Chinese MSS officer that was recruiting assets inside of American companies, and they were able to extradite, to lure him to Belgium, I believe, right, John, and extradite him here. And you've seen insiders that are trying to steal these foundation models, which, as we heard from Ben Buchanan yesterday, are considered national treasures, right, and really important to our national security. And we now have essentially export controls on those models that rivals things that we've seen in the 90s with encryption and the crypto wars. What do you think our ability is as an industry to combat that insider human asset component, the bridging of cyber and human asset, where, I remember there was even a case in ransomware with Tesla where they were trying to bribe an employee in Tesla to deploy malware within the network, right? Those cases are becoming more and more common. I mentioned yesterday that, I'm seeing companies hiring North Koreans right now just for collecting a paycheck, but easily going to get transferred into potentially backdoors, theft, etc. How can we deal with that as an industry? And cybersecurity companies are getting targeted with that as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, so I think from the human perspective, right, we're always going to see, Paul, you mentioned like that in general, new technology is going to favor the offense before it favors the defense. And any kind of crime, you're always going to have attackers who have more to gain and more potential ROI than the defense does. From this scale, though, so my organization, we conduct over 1,000 investigations per year. Less than 5% of those have anything to do with an insider attack. So that's still a very relatively small percentage of the types of attacks we see. And to be quite frank, most of those those are the ones that get detected even much earlier in the chain. There are certainly rare cases when we've all, seen them, and certainly many investigations with people who've been spies and been successful for many years. I think, though, that's by and large more rare than what we are typically seeing today. I also think when you look at now the proliferation of generative AI and the scale with which we're dealing with these attacks, that's an area that concerns me, especially as we're marching closer towards November and a major election here, as well as many major elections throughout the world this year. I think that is going to have an impact on our ability to respond. And I don't mean my team, I mean our entire industry, right? A scale of potential attacks, whether it's related to misinformation and disinformation, or whether it's nation state actors, cyber criminals, who all have intent to cause disruption at a similar time. The way that I think that we will effectively work through that, again, kind of my optimism shining here, is the fact that as an industry, I think we're working more collaboratively than we ever have been. I have recent examples of that, of our teams across the board, organizations that are our competitors, and certainly between public and private partnerships, sharing information on a daily basis in an automated capacity that's not only, hey, here's new IOCs and new patterns, but here's specifically how we are investigating these attacks. Are you all learning anything different than what we're identifying? And that happening is at such a frequent scale that I think that the human element of that component, of the nefarious side of it, worries me less than what I see with our ability to work together to combat these problems.
Let me just push back on you, because again, having just had this experience in the last few weeks with the North Koreans. And North Koreans, by the way, I don't know if you all agree with me here, but I think they're the most innovative threat actor by a mile. Not always the most technically sophisticated, but they always come up with ingenious ways. I mean, going back to, I remember 2009, the first ones to use destructive attacks at scale, wiper malware in Korea that, since then has been used in lots of places. The first ones with Sony to do hack and leak, long before the Russians decided to do it in 2016 election. First ones to use crypto and really focus on that from a theft perspective, and asking for ransoms, remember with WannaCry, and then of course the ransomware ecosystem picked it up. And now they realize that with this move in the COVID era in particular to remote work, it is really, really easy to get hired, right? And particularly with generative AI, crafting these resumes that look amazing. I mean, literally the case I was dealing with, the person claimed to have worked at Amazon, worked at Meta. The resume was stellar. The interview process just aced it. Although there was this weird sign where they would take like 30 seconds to answer a question, but answered every question, including the technical tests. And companies increasingly hiring remote, right? So this is, the North Koreans are pioneering us right now for collecting a paycheck, but I think it's a matter of time before ransomware crews, other nation states pick this up, right? And we're going to be facing with and by the way, I want to mention, like, these were small companies that hired them. If it's happening there, the scale of this, I think,
it's
is
happening at big companies too, right? We've investigated a number of these type of cases.
That's everywhere, right?
Yeah, we've investigated these for really the last 18 months, I think. And so to your point of will that proliferate to other groups, that's possible. But I think the thing that we've seen, again, with going back to kind of that pattern recognition, is the fact that in these organizations, yes, these fake or non-legitimate employees may get through the hiring process, but it's within hours to days with which they're getting detected by the organizations that they're getting employed, because the activity doesn't add up. So I think in that sense, it's also a positive example of how the human interconnected activity really has been positive for identifying that.
All right, so Heather and Paul, a variant of this question, but more focused on your companies. Again, you guys Heather, you produce Gemini, the critical national security tool. Amazon hosts, both customer models and partner models on their platforms. How do you guys make sure that those models don't walk out the door through cyber or insider means?
Yeah, well, let me demystify a little bit about development. And actually, the Anthropic and OpenAI guys are here, and you should definitely pick their brains about this. They know way more than I do. So we know that AI is software. Hopefully, everybody knows that. You have an algorithm component. It is trained on a data set. These data sets are increasingly large. Okay, and then they are fine-tuned with weights, which are essentially files with numbers in them. When we talk about AI theft, people are often talking about the code and the weights. Okay, but the thing is, these weights are adjusted based on what we learn from training on the data. You can't take the data. That's like petabytes and petabytes and petabytes, and you need oodles and oodles of storage and processing capability to actually put the three components together. And then on top of that, there's fine-tuning, et cetera, et cetera. And then you gotta be able to run it, right? So merely taking these files alone is not all that helpful.
But hold on a second. So you have Meta open source Llama, and people are building interesting capabilities on top of Llama. So the weights and the models are still really valuable, right?
The weights and the models are still valuable, but they're not going to be able to recreate Gemini, for example, just because they took source code. But let me also point out the transfer property, which is actually when I talk to the AI researchers about how they've been doing their research for the past 10 years, they've all been publishing, A, and B, they all keep an eye on what the other one is doing by querying each other's chatbots. And actually, if you can throw enough queries at a chatbot, you can more or less recreate the behavior of the model. You don't even need to steal the code. You don't need the weights. So I want to demystify it a little bit and say, this is more than just source code, which we lock down, we protect. It is also about protecting the training data. It's about protecting the weights. And it's also about understanding who's trying to copy the behavior of your model, right? Because that is also very, very possible. But in the end, this does not look like any other data protection problem we've ever had. We know how to lock down data. We lock down Gmail. We know how to lock down code. We've been working on, highly competitive and interesting technology like self-driving cars and quantum, so we know how to lock that down. And we know how to deal with abuse on the platforms. It is also possible to recreate Google search if you can throw enough queries at Google search. So a lot of the things that we've been using in the past work for large language models as well.
Paul, your take?
So as background, let's remember that Moore's Law has given us a really dramatic exponential rise over the decades in the size and cost and performance of transistors. I would have liked to see that used to meet some security goals. For example, we're talking about memory-safe languages now, but if we had reserved 1% of the new capacity out of the last 10 doublings just for bounds checking and so forth, we could still be using C, but it would be safe by now. We didn't. We threw everything that Moore's Law gave us at the problem that we were trying to solve, which did not include security. And yet, there are two improvements that have given us the ability to practice some security goals that were totally impractical even 20 years ago. And that is the speed of networks and the density of storage. And so now the industry has moved towards zero trust. And in the situation of zero trust, your ability to come from inside the network does not connote any special privileges. You have to have credentials that are provable all the way back to some shared root of trust and so forth. And that's done at every single transaction, billions of times per second, which you would never have thought you could do until networks got really fast, CPUs got fast enough. And then you can record what you permitted to occur and the credential that asked you to perform that operation, because we have enough storage. And in that environment, an insider attack becomes, it's not impossible yet, but it is now way more risky and way more likely to be detected as an anomaly and then to be investigated as a crime than it was even a few short years ago. And because of all of that, I'm actually an optimist on this one narrow topic, which is insider attacks are no longer as easy as stealing candy from a baby, which is what I remember from the 80s and 90s.
You were stealing candy from a baby?
I was the baby.
On that, we turned Paul Vixie into an optimist. We absolutely would have to end it there. I do want to make a quick plug because Zero Trust came out of Heather's teamwork that was called Beyond Corp, post-Aurora in 2010 when you guys decided to look at the lessons of that attack and how to completely re-architect your network. So didn't just help Google, but helped the entire ecosystem. But we truly have legendary panelists here with so many years of experience, although very young, all of us, in this field. And please give them a round of applause. Thank you.